Going to make a start. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this IWA webinar, Delivering a Nature Positive, Climate Resilient Economy, which, as I said, is brought to you in partnership with WWF Cymru. I'm Joe Rossiter, and I'm the co-director for the IWA, the Institute of Welsh Affairs. The IWA is Wales's leading independent think tank. We've got a long track record of shaping debates and influencing change in Wales through our policy research and advocacy, our online and print publication, The Welsh Agenda, which provide platforms for robust comment and debate, and our agenda-setting events, such as this one. We're also a membership organisation with organisational and individual members from across Wales, but also far further afield. If you'd like to know more about what the IWA does and support us, then please consider joining us as a member and help shape Wales's future with us. Now, today's event is part of our ongoing series ahead of the Senedd elections in partnership with WWF Cymru, which we're having conversations which discuss the four focus areas that are outlined in WWF Cymru's Senedd election manifesto. So these are healthier seas, greener jobs in the economy, fairer food and farming, and cleaner rivers. You can listen back to the podcast that we recorded earlier in the year on healthier seas. It was a fascinating and really important conversation. So yeah, check that out on our website and our podcast provider of choice. And this is the first in our webinar series with WWF Cymru. Before we kick off, gonna do some housekeeping. Please feel free to introduce yourselves, attendees, and engage with each other in the chat. Say hello, share your email if you're willing to be contacted by other attendees. We're all coming to this event because we're interested in the subject matter that we're discussing. As this is a webinar on Zoom, participants, attendees that is, are muted by me, the host, and if you want to ask any questions to the panelists, we're going to leave a lot of space for audience questions at the end of the webinar. Then please use the Q&A function rather than the chat. The chat is where you can share links and talk about what we're discussing. The Q&A function is for what you want to ask of the panelists. So yeah, make sure you respect that distinction. So yes, have a look at the bottom of the page of your screen and get thinking about your questions now. There'll be plenty of time to ask the panelists all these questions. Please remember, chat and questions are recorded, so don't put anything in there that you don't want shared. And we'll be keeping to an hour, strictly an hour maximum for this conversation. Finally, recording of today's event will be made available on both the IWA's website and YouTube channel. So if those of you have colleagues who you think might be interested in the event, then please do keep your eyes peeled because we'll be sharing it publicly. So now, all the housekeeping out of the way, on to today's discussion, delivering a nature positive, climate resilient economy in Wales. Now, we all depend on the natural world as the foundation upon which our economy is built. Yet they all too often remain in conflict. Species and habitat loss are at an all-time high, with around 1 in 5 species in Wales at risk of extinction. And Wales is also feeling the rising costs of climate change today. Flooding, droughts, wildfires are having drastic consequences for communities across Wales today. And these weather events also hit people in Wales disproportionately, all too often leaving low-income households at the most severe threat. In this webinar, what we're going to try and do is have a conversation where we explore the role of nature at the heart of our economy and highlight ways in which a greener economic transition can benefit people in Wales. It'll be an opportunity to discuss the role of nature-based solutions and explore how action to restore nature and build resilience to climate change can have a positive economic impact, helping us to tackle wider challenges like the cost of living, health challenges, jobs, and protection for our communities over the long term in Wales. Right, on to our introduction of our panelists who've been sitting there patiently while I introduce the subject matter of the discussion. And I think we've got a perfect blend of experience and expertise to discuss these questions with you. Everyone's sitting in a slightly different space, which I think is the best way to have these conversations. So, brief introductions. We've got Professor Calvin Jones. He's a professor at Cork University Business School and director of Jones The Numbers. He's also an IWA Honorary Fellow. Gareth Clubb is also joining us. You're director of WWF Cymru. We've also got Michelle Leavesey. She's Chief Sustainability Officer at Admiral, who are a huge financial services provider and an anchor institution based here in Wales, and obviously have a key stake to play as a large-scale insurance company. And we've got Shav Taj, who is General Secretary of Wales TUC. She's also Welsh Labour's lead candidate for Caerdydd on Taff, but that's not the capacity in which he's joining today. So, want to make that very explicit at the outset. Shav is nodding, which is good. So, this is going to be a free-flowing, hopefully, conversation. No set presentations. The panelists will, feel free to interrupt me or each other if you have something to say. So, to kick us off, what I want to do is start with some general questions and go from there. So, open question. I'll come to you, Gareth, to start, and then we can go around. How important is restoring nature and tackling climate change to the future of the Welsh economy, Gareth?
Thanks, Joe. I think there's this maybe misconception out there in the public sphere that the economy just kind of rumbles along. Sometimes it does a bit better, sometimes a bit worse, and that it's unaffected by issues around nature and climate. That's it's not true historically, and there's plenty of texts that you can go to look at which spell out how civilizations of the past have collapsed, partly in many cases as a result of environmental degradation. It may have been kind of more true over perhaps in the last century or parts of the last century, but it certainly isn't true right now, and it won't be true in the future because the impacts of climate change and extreme weather caused or exacerbated by climate change are they're having an impact on people now. They're having an impact on communities right now. So, for example, the impact of climate change has increased food bills by an average of £360 or so over 2022 and 2023. Research commissioned by WWF Cymru shows that extreme weather cost farmers £175 million in 2018 alone. And bearing in mind that the gross output of agriculture in Wales is about 1.7 billion, you're looking at more than 10% of the overall output of agriculture. So the costs that are being faced by consumers and by industry, including the agriculture industry, are absolutely massive now. That shows that nature and climate, they're not just side issues, they are fundamental, foundational importance. And just a few weeks ago, we saw a revelation by ITV actually in relation to the UK government national security report on nature and biodiversity that said that the potential economic damage of kind of ignoring the damage that's been caused to nature could lead to as much as a 12% decrease in GDP by 2030 than it would have been otherwise. And for context, the expenditure on the NHS is 11% of GDP. So, potentially catastrophic. And I think just because we seem to have kind of got away with it as if you like, so far, doesn't mean that we are going to continue to get away with it forever, because we're reaching various tipping points, or we're close to tipping points that can have very significant implications. Just one of them, very briefly, would be the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. If that were to stop, then Wales would be a very different place in 200 years' time, not only because it'll be a lot colder, because also presumably we'll be full of Scots who won't be able any longer to live in Scotland because it'll be much too cold, even for Scots. So I'll leave it there, Joe.
Thank you. Yeah, good scene setting. Shav, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, just to say I love the Scots, so I'm okay with them. with them being there. But look, for me, I'm going to be my big thing in all of this is about. I think that we are definitely at a crossroads now in the UK, but also here in Wales, and we've got to start genuinely investing in our future, and that is an absolute priority. We can see what is happening already. We continue to be exposed to all kinds of global shocks, whether that, and that potentially will be not only give us cause for concern in terms of a humanitarian crisis, but also, the shock of then people losing their jobs and falling even further behind. From a global perspective as well, we can see that the direction of travel has been very clear. Major economies, including the EU, the US, and China, they've all been, investing very much at a large scale to transform their industries and their infrastructure and energy systems to that net zero future. And they're very much backing clean manufacturing, clean power, and strategic public investment to secure jobs, but also competitiveness and energy security. And quite honestly, Wales and the UK has not been keeping a pace with that. The recent events that have underlined, why that matters, the conflict in Iran, for example, again, all of that, every single day we're seeing what the impact of that is on our global energy markets. And of course, even though, very little of our energy comes directly from that region, prices, of course, are set globally, right? And so that instability, miles and miles away, quickly translates into, of course, even higher bills, even higher costs for businesses, but also the delivery of our public services. And so there, as has already been mentioned, there's already a massive pressure on household budgets, including here in Wales. So we're way too exposed at the moment. Our economy is way too exposed to fossil fuels. Gas continues to set the price of electricity. Lots of our, homes still rely on it for heating. We've always, for a very long time, from a trade union perspective, we've been talking about the need to upgrade our infrastructure to future-proof industries, maintain public services, but also for us to then be in a position where we are actually able to meet our energy and climate goals. And all of that then, it means we're able to build new railways, new factories, clean power, and the energy networks that we need, because our ecosystems, have been degraded, and that increased risk as to flood risk has already been mentioned, food production, and of course the bigger ongoing cost to the public. But from a union perspective, for us, this is our real genuine anxiety about what we could lose, and how we could become even poorer. Our communities and society could become even more unequal, while we see other countries then move ahead. And we already know that investment at scale can deliver. So analysis in 2023 showed that UK government investment of around 74 to 78 billion in energy and industrial projects could actually unlock a similar scale of additional private investment. And public investment then doesn't crowd out the market, it crowds it in. So investment in our future, program, backed by strong conditions on job creation and job quality, ultimately then could also protect existing manufacturing jobs by decarbonizing them, giving us, new skill jobs in industrial communities as well. We've seen what the impact, was when it came to Port Talbot, for example, where, in that space where we really need to now start looking at what that future modern industrial strategy looks like, and using that as well as a basis for how we can then, of course, create opportunities for more women, for Black, Asian, minority ethnic workers, disabled workers. We can have a real good industrial plan for our communities. So we can't, when we talk about a nature positive, climate resilient economy, what we're talking about is jobs, energy security, economic resilience, and ultimately fairness. So that for me is the real thing here. That this is we've got an opportunity. We've got to get on with it, and we've got to move at pace.
Thank you, Shav. Yeah, useful introductory remarks. Cal.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So obviously I agree with all of that, but I'll try and make a slightly different point. So Wales has historically had a very thin economy, concentrated in a very small number of products. We've had an economy which has lacked any kind of autonomy separate to UK or global economic systems, and we've lacked innovation, skills, qualifications. And it seems to me that taking a more positive and opportunistic approach to thinking about what nature friendliness, climate resilience does, it enables us potentially at least to move to the front of the pack in terms of understanding how you can protect and promote human well-being sustainably within complex systems in ways which don't degrade those complex systems. I mean, if you look at I know this because part of my sins or theirs, on the board of NRW, and when you've got hundreds of thousands of hectares of conifers or whatever it is, not quite that much, but it's difficult to think about how that single product fits within these really complicated, interrelated ecosystems. With various biodiversity drivers, climate drivers which emerge from different activities on that land. So I think if we were genuine and serious about nature friendliness in the way that we created prosperity rather than just products, then I think we might end up with a really important set of learnings in terms of both technical innovation, but also governance innovation, social innovation, changing the way we consume in ways which would be actually very valuable to spread that learning to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Calvin. Michelle.
Joe, I think I'm going to build on everybody's answers. I guess building on my own role as Chief Sustainability Officer at Admiral, my role is to identify the risks and help to mitigate, as well as the opportunities, as Calvin said. So the bottom line is that taking a risk perspective, climate risk is economic risk for Wales, and nature is our most important first line of defence. And when climate impacts increase, as Chav mentioned, the shockwaves are felt across the economy. Businesses are disrupted, communities affected, and people feel it directly. And we've seen that recently with flooding in places like Monmouthshire and other parts of Wales. Some of those images, media images, are very hard to get out of our minds. And those shocks will take significant time to recover from. And I think what often gets missed in the discussion around nature is that degraded nature makes those shocks so much worse. When wetlands are drained, peatlands degraded, rivers constrained, and green space lost, water moves faster, damage spreads quicker, and that's why restoring nature matters. Those wetland soils and catchments help slow the flow, reduce flood peaks, and protect communities downstream. So when Admiral talks about nature as the largest private sector employer in Wales, we are talking about climate and nature from the perspective of, as other speakers have said, jobs, livelihoods, local economic resilience. So to me, there is a clear cycle. More climate damage means more disruption and more losses. Ultimately, people's pockets are affected, as we heard previously, and nobody wins from that. That's why investing in nature restoration, resilience, and prevention isn't just an environmental priority, it's an economic one. And a sustainable business needs a sustainable environment. And in Wales, that connection is immediate. Healthy ecosystems underpin a healthy local economy.
Thanks, Michelle. I think you did well of doing my job there, which was bringing together what everyone said into one coherent argument. And I guess what we're saying then in response to that initial prompt of, how important is restoring nature and tackling climate change to the Welsh economy, well, is clearly from all of your different perspectives is absolutely central. And you've kind of got these two sides of it, of the risk, but also the opportunity. It's an opportunity as much as it is a risk, and that nature, climate, and our economy are all inherently interconnected, and as Calvin kind of said, it's a very complex system to get your head around, but they're all kind of three sides of the same coin, albeit coins only have two sides. So with that in mind, we're hearing a lot recently about kind of opposition to the climate agenda, which attempt to frame climate change, net zero, nature protection policies as, as a cost and burdensome on, ordinary people, and that the transitions that we require to net zero are too expensive to achieve, and potentially those questions are more stark when we talk about them from the devolved policy level, where we all know we don't have all of the money to do everything we might want to do in a devolved sense. So what are your kind of perspectives on these points? What are the best ways to counteract opposition to progress on achieving a more climate resilient economy? Is it, and there's that balance between communicating the risks clearly, not only the long-term risks, but the risks that people are already feeling, as you've spoken to, especially with flooding in Monmouthshire, for example. People can see and feel that in very tangible ways, even if they're not personally affected by it. So how do we balance that kind of the clearly articulating the risk and clearly articulating what the opportunity is beyond superseding the risk, if that makes sense, so that it can tackle those inherently connected problems like the cost of living crisis that Shav you've spoken about. Who wants to come in on this? Gareth, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joe. And I think there's an issue here about articulating, because what we have done as people who are working in this field, really well-meaning, probably backed up with plenty of science and evidence and so on, is we have articulated, and look where it's got us, right? It's got us to a stage where the populists are running amok, and where they can say with impunity, quite frankly, about stupid net zero or whatever they want to call it, and about how action on climate is overly expensive and so on. So I think the issue. So the Overton window, we don't abandon that space. We need to keep on being in that space, but we can't just depend on our sensible, well-meaning arguments holding sway in this febrile atmosphere. I think so. There's a couple of things. One is the urgency of getting practical solutions. So I mean, it feels kind of trite to say it, but when people feel that there is a difference to their quality of life as a result of some of the changes that people have already mentioned. We talked about insulating homes, making sure that homes are warmer. When the renewable energy actually starts to have a downward impact on bills, which of course it is having, but because the other price shocks that other people have mentioned, bills are continuing to go up despite the impact of renewables in bringing bills lower than they would have been otherwise. Cleaner water and streets that are safe from flooding, and importantly, I think jobs in a sustainable economy that are spread throughout Wales and pay a decent wage. Insulating homes and draft-proofing homes and so on is a classic example of where that type of mobilization of people can be made. The other precondition, I think, is around genuine participation and local ownership, because when people feel that they have a genuine say in what the solutions are, that they are more willing to defend and stand up for them. And if we look around us in this space, I know because there's been quite a few inquiries and reviews that have set out how unwelcoming or how the environmental sector doesn't appear to be very well representative of the general population. And so, when we look around us, where are our homeless friends, for example? Where are compatriots of colour? Where are young people who, frankly, are going to have to end up dealing with the mess that we leave behind? So, have we got the right voices in the room to be able to articulate and to communicate, even if that were, a valid part of the answer?
Joe, I'm happy to add, I don't see this as a choice between climate action and affordability. The two are deeply connected. And when we delay action, the costs don't disappear. They build up and land harder later on households, businesses, and public services, as Gareth has just outlined. So we see very practical examples of how climate positive choices also can reduce costs today. And I think we need to promote those better. And as Gareth said, perhaps find a new language around how we promote that. So just to give you a practical example in our world. So in the motor business, the use of what used to be called secondhand parts today are called green parts, means that cars can be repaired more quickly and are at a lower cost. And for many people, a car isn't an option. It's an essential for getting to work, carrying responsibilities in everyday life. So going back to Calvin's point about the social resilience, and when customers are comfortable accepting a recycled part, it improves repair times, lowers costs, and is a win-win for the environmental impact because we're not having to reproduce that part. And so solutions, when designed well, climate action can make life easier, not harder for ordinary people.
Yeah, I think part of that is similar to what Calvin's kind of spoken about complex systems. Is those kind of examples are really useful because it kind of cuts through that noise and says, actually, this is where it's not a trade-off between, long-term climate impact and reducing bills and affordability right now. Does anyone else want to come in on the question around counteracting opposition to progress on. Yeah, go on, Shav.
Yeah, so look, we did some research into whether or not people actually understand what a just transition looks like, and what that means. And well, most people said they didn't understand it. And so as soon as we started talking about the fact that this means that you get to have a say over what your job in the future is going to look like, what your employer is going to be doing, where investments are going to be going, what sort of skills you're going to need for the future, it started landing a bit better. And when, we had, some of the unprogressive views from political parties who were sort of saying, for example, oh, the answer in Wales is to reopen the coal mines. Well, actually, it was the miners' union who came out very strongly and sort of said, this is absolute nonsense. And so coming from that worker perspective, then bringing in that younger voice to say, well, actually, the future is this, having young people from those communities speaking up and talking about the impact at that time and what their future should look like, I think is what makes the difference. So sometimes it's about connecting the dots, for having real voices front and center and telling their own story, rather than lots of us in these sorts of environments just talking at it at a sort of very bigger scale. The other thing I would say is that when it comes to money that's spent in Wales, we've always made it very clear that people should know how that money is being spent, what the purpose of that expenditure is, particularly, when it comes to public sector, public investment. And people need to be able to follow that through. So connecting the dots in that wider scale and working in social partnership, I think, can make a real difference as well.
Thanks. Yeah, and I guess that brings us on to being really explicit about when we say the climate friendly or nature-based jobs of the future, about being really explicit about what they are. So does anyone have any examples of, what are nature-based jobs, for example? What are they? Where are they now? Where are they likely to be in the future? And how do we practically create more of them? Because I think that kind of digs down into what the practicalities of this is. Calvin, you want to come
Well,
in?
I mean, just one example, when we came out of the pandemic, we were talking about inventing a national nature service, which would have ten thousands of people of all ages engaged in very visible nature restoration, improving places, literally cleaning up litter, all these kind of things, improving, the landscape. We didn't do that, and we haven't, as a region, stroke government, stroke economy, invested in large scale employment opportunities, which are clearly there if you find the way to fund them, to show people exactly what is possible, and not just in terms of earning money, but then having a genuine local impact, in the same way as, we talk about insulation, which is problematic for lots of behavioural reasons, in terms of, my 120-year-old house, technically as well. But there are things we could have done in terms of low-hanging fruit, and we haven't done. And the National Nature Service now is a handful of people so far, and that needs examination, I think.
So in regards to that, that's kind of a public sector response, but there's also, private sector, third sector responses to that in regards to, jobs as well, isn't there? And linking to that, especially the public sector opportunity, tallies pretty well with economic and activity rates, which are, pretty horrifically bad in a Welsh context, certainly. Building on the back of that, Calvin, I want to stick with you. We've been reading your report for WWF Cymru, Tir Dyfodol, imagining a future fit rural landscape. Can you give us an overview of that report, what it says about the distinct economic challenges that parts of rural Wales in particular face? And, it's fair to say that Wales is to a large extent, especially by, land volume, a rural nation. So could you give us a difficult challenge, but can you give us an overview of that report, some of the challenges, but also some of the significant opportunities we have of building a more green rural economy in communities across Wales?
Yes, I mean, we're not only a very rural economy, but we're also a monoculture economy, and we've got 80% of the landscape covered in sheep. Another 10, 12% in trees, conifers for production. Most of those. The problem is when you've got, the reason I'm not coming to you as a professor of Cardiff Business School is because we found out what happened when you rely overly on a small kind of product set. In our case, it was international students. And when that happens and they go south, you're in trouble. And, and that lesson I've told farmers this since is it would be well learned by sectors with a very small number of products, which look really vulnerable. So I think there's something about the way that we have been that Wales has developed as a resource periphery and continues to develop now with wind turbines, for example, and recreation activities from people outside of Wales as a resource periphery, which takes power away from us, takes autonomy away from us. And I think we have to at some point accept that the current spatial settlement in terms of what goes on in Wales is not fit for the future. I mean, Tir Dyfodol is all about fit for the future rural landscapes. Now, I think that report said last year we are not in a place yet to decide what a future rural Wales looks like. And my suggestion was that the next Senedd term needed to be spent building intelligence, data, understanding, trust, planning resource, conversations around what we wanted Wales to look like, rural Wales to look like, in a way which built resilience, widened the product mix, built income amongst rural communities, protected the language, decentralized activity. We are not in a place where we can do that yet. There's very little trust in the system. There's very little headroom in the system. There's very little ability to strategically think in the system. We need, I think, a period, and the next sentence will seem to be the right period, to think about what rural Wales looks like in 50 or 100 years' time and build the ability to genuinely scenario plan and think about our futures in ways which at the moment, frankly, don't have the data or ability or the right conversations to happen.
Yeah, so the report calls for essentially some collaboration thinking time because it kind of recognizes that we're not in the space to have a very useful conversation at the moment. And I guess some of that you could see in some of the response conversations in the sustainable farming scheme, that
Yeah.
inherently, but underpinning that kind of change is a move, towards land stewardship in amongst producing agricultural products, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the frustration is because I mean, coming back to the point made earlier by several contributors on the panel that climate costs don't go away if you ignore them. The uneconomic production of Welsh lamb is not going to go away as climate taxes maybe increase, or as we have ever more agreements with lamb producing countries the other side of the world. So unfortunately, we're in a position where we are in stasis. We are unable to persuade farmers and farming unions, other people living in the rural landscape, some people who are using the rural landscapes of Wales for quite narrow purposes, recreational purposes, second home purposes. We don't have at the moment any way of surfacing and considering these really complicated issues around how we build a more resilient and more flood resilient and more a set of rural products which are much more widely differentiated. And I think the depoliticization of that somehow and the encouragement for people to get involved in that conversation, even if they don't live in rural landscapes, is really important. The national conversation we had a decade ago, or more than a decade ago, around which led to the Future Generations Act, for better or worse, I think is necessary again in ways which really dig down into what we think the rural landscape can do for us using the science and engaging people with that science in order to make better choices.
And I guess it's that rural communities at the moment might feel like they're being hammered by lots of different things. You've got climate change on one side, but then you're also, expected in order to get access to public money to do a list of things that you've never had to do before
Yeah.
in order to get that. So it feels like similar to what we've kind of been talking about the whole time is like you feel like there's a lot of cost in the system, and every time you're engaging with government, it comes at a cost. Whereas you're kind of saying, yeah, we need to have that conversation, but at the same time, it needs to have a kind of positive vision of what the future might look like 50 years in the future.
That's right. And I think there's a really good book called, well, good depressing book called Collapse by Jared Diamond, and he says when civilizations are faced with really stark change, and they are faced with going through the eye of a needle to find some sort of future, the question is, what do you really value, and what are you prepared to leave behind? And my question would be, like, do we really value sheep that much?
Yeah, Joe, other people may have read, there was a really interesting article on the BBC website just a couple of days ago. Sheep are disappearing from our hills and our dinner plates. And there was a really profound quote in there from a sheep farmer who said that he has shifted his farm from a peak of over 800 lambing sheep to just 45, and says, I dread to think where the farm would have been financially had we not started to make those changes. I either continued along the sheep farming route because of sentimentality or made bold decisions. And I think that idea about diversification, and Calvin has spoken very eloquently on the narrowness of the Welsh economy, on having monoculture, and diversification of the rural economy is it's absolutely critical, I think, for having any real long-term future coherence into as to what the communities are going to look like. And Cameron says, what do we value? Well, to my mind, there's a whole range of things that rural communities bring to the rich tapestry of life in Wales, but not least amongst them are this idea of community, but also the Welsh language. And if rural communities are in some sort of stasis and don't recognize the opportunities that and the threats, of course, partly but the opportunities in relation to nature and climate, and levering in potentially some of the private sector finance, which is looking for a home in ways that can ameliorate, for example, flooding downstream and so on. Those opportunities are there, and I think there's a somewhere in the middle of all this, there's got to be a meeting of a potential meeting place for financial sector industries and for those who hold land, in order to be able to make investment that will provide decent rural employment for people in nature services and climate mitigating services.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to this question of food and land use in a future WWF Cymru podcast as well. So just a note to watch out for that if you're interested in this specifically. So a bit of a move to Michelle. As we've discussed throughout this webinar, as a result of climate change, we're seeing increasingly frequent extreme weather events, flooding, droughts, which are having big impacts on communities across Wales. Can you give us some idea of how that is impacting your business, Admiral?
Absolutely. And it's interesting hearing the speakers talk about a range of impacts, but I guess coming back to what is the cost of human life, because that's the crux of what we're dealing with at Admiral. It's affecting our customers, our communities, and also our people who live across Wales. And so, of course, there's a financial impact, and I know that that's what we're talking about, greening the economy and those kind of things. But I just want to keep it human for a while. Human impact goes so much further, and disruption, stress, displacement, long recovery periods. We all know what it feels like when we're disrupted. We have an issue at home, and perhaps we have to live with a family and friends for a while. But to be honest, Joe, when you sit in those call centres, there's a reason that those call centre handlers in Cardiff and Swansea have access to counselling and support, because when people phone in crisis as a result of extreme weather events, it really becomes really brought to life in a way that is really real, tangible, and hence why we have a net zero goal of 2040, because we sense the catalyst for change is needed now. We need to act now. So customers trust, I think Calvin mentioned trust, and the customers look for how we turn up in those moments. So it's not just about claiming, paying those claims, and of course in extreme weather events losses increase dramatically, but it's also now today expected that we support our people in building their resilience. So some of the initiatives you'll have seen from Admiral, things like the flood bus that visits local communities, the flood force campaign with the National Trust. So we've recently launched a 3-year flagship partnership with the National Trust, which is significant. It's where we have pooled, our customer funding, brand funding, sustainability funding, and pulled it all together so that we can look at a range of projects. And I do think that Wales provides a great opportunity as a living laboratory to test and trial some of the initiatives. So things like restoring peatland, managing river flow, particularly upstream of large conurbations. One of my favourite projects at the moment, the beaver release, hot off the heels of Hoppers. I don't know if anyone's seen that film, but over the weekend, but young kids love it and it's absolutely super. But that beaver project to help slow the flow of water has captured our people in a way I can't even describe. It's so impactful. And we've got cameras in the office where we can see how the beavers are getting on and keep track of the beavers. And it's just bringing the whole thing to life. And so we're also working with Earthwatch Europe. We've introduced the first Earth schools to Wales. So we're focusing on education, prevention and long-term resilience there as well. And then one of my most exciting parts is probably leadership. So looking at nature-based leadership, and because we recognise that every leader in Admiral needs to have an understanding of how climate risk impacts decision making. So we're looking at some quite innovative approaches. Obviously, people on this screen are much more knowledgeable than I, but things like biomimicry and how we can learn from nature and bring that into leadership and into our businesses, and we're extending that across our supply chain. So ensuring that the green skills that you spoke about previously, for us, we do need an upskilled supply chain across our garage network and home environment. So we are funding projects for nature rangers with the National Trust, through to solar panel engineers, and a range of what would be categorized as green jobs. But we hope that in the future that becomes more mainstream and is not labeled green, but it's just labeled the norm as future goes.
Yeah, and it's good to hear, some of the tangible examples of where you as a large anchor institution are putting your money where your mouth is when it comes to funding some of the solutions rather than the cleanup costs of, it's that kind of embedding long-term thinking with nature literacy throughout a large organization, which can sometimes be quite challenging, I guess, to create that kind of culture change. Okay, I'm looking at the clock and seeing we've got quite a few questions in the Q&A. Shav, I want to come to you to give you an opportunity to kind of talk to, from your union perspective, some brief insight into the challenges that industry is facing, and what you feel is needed to kind of safeguard Welsh industry in a way that corresponds with a net zero pathway. You kind of mentioned Port Talbot as maybe potentially a risk of how we could do things not optimally, potentially up to this point. But I don't want to speak for you, so I'll let you speak.
Yeah, I mean, look, Wales has I would say, quite a difficult industrial history of workers feeling genuinely left behind. And we've always said that it doesn't have to be this way, right? And that we've all talked about this now being an opportunity to engage and support Welsh workers and communities, particularly those in carbon-heavy industries, and allowing them to become a part of the solution for what that greener economy can look like. And just to give you, I guess, a couple of just quick examples of some of situations where this has happened already quite successfully. So in Ratcliffe Power Station, which was the last coal-fired power station in Britain, DMB, Prospect and Unite the Union worked with the employer to then successfully redeploy that workforce before it shut down. In Vauxhall, Ellesmere Port, again, workers fought to make sure that the company's decision to transition to electric vehicle production did not lead to any unwarranted redundancies, and that degradation of job quality and they managed to successfully guard against an unjust transition. And also in 2023, we called for a UK public energy champion company as well that could then accelerate the deployment of new clean power, including developing new technologies where the private sector was, a bit slow to scale up, including floating offshore wind, tidal stream, zero carbon hydrogen, and new nuclear. And then for us, I guess the big thing in all of this, and it's, we haven't mentioned it today, but it is important to mention, of course, is what does that future look like? We hear about data centers quite often, right? And we hear about AI and automation and the impact that that will have on people. But there's some opportunities there as well around efficiency and innovation and how AI can optimize that energy system, predict maintenance in renewables, streamline retrofitting, etc. But that can only happen if we have a just transition, if we have proper plans in place, like the recently created energy skills passport that, guards against any kind of exploitation, that gives us green jobs for oil and gas workers. But we need to then see similar pathways for other workers as well, particularly those in other carbon heavy industries. There's the Welsh Government recent green personal learning account again that offers routes to net zero skills. But workers need to know that this is the stuff that's available to them. They need to see what that pathway looks like. And we, before I got onto this call, I was on another call with ministers talking about the industrial strategy, and everything just feels far away. And no one's really clear in terms of what that future is going to look like. And so wherever we are in Wales, whether we're talking to communities or we're talking to workers, we need to have that conversation quite quickly, because I just worry that people will get left behind.
Thanks, Shab. That's a really useful perspective. Okay, we're going to go to audience Q&A. Panelists, shout if you want to answer them. You're not expected to answer all of them. So first one is from Barbara from Size of Wales. How do we make sure that Wales is tackling climate change and nature loss together, both locally through land use and farming and globally through the impact of what we import and consume? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I can just speak to the interconnected nature of the nature and climate crises, and also the global flows. We've WWF Cymru has commissioned work that looks at the impact alongside actually Size of Wales, looks at the impact of how chicken farming in Powys, which ends up pouring a bunch of manure that ends up with high phosphate levels in the River Wye, for example, allegedly. The soy that is fed to the chickens is coming from the region in Brazil around the Amazon, some of which is related to deforestation. And so we have this completely unsustainable food chain of feed coming into Wales, being used by people, by farming industries in order to produce cheap chicken. And we've run into all sorts of issues, right? So we've got cost of living, we've got increase in fuel prices, we've got people who are interested in eating high protein foods, and actually, if you look at the overall life cycle of a chicken reared in some of these sheds, it's one of the most kind of energy efficient ways of raising high protein animal foods. And I suppose the answer to this is, well, there are plenty of high protein vegetable foods which don't need any of these inputs or need very little of them. And this is why one of the, I'm not going to preach about going vegetarian, but frankly, we should all be going as much vegetarian as we possibly can, because that would avoid a whole bunch of these negative impacts. But absolutely, nature and climate all interconnected, and we're facing some pretty severe impacts. Just report after report comes out from the UN, or hidden ones from the UK government, or wherever they are. They're all saying this is flashing red. It's an emergency, and yet you look around you, both at government and in the public consciousness, and you see people just and politicians of all flavours going about the business as if oh, nothing to see here. So I think there's definitely an element of realism that needs to be injected, but of course then you run into the populists on the other side. So it is a really tricky one, no easy answers. If Shav gets elected, good luck to you with dealing with some of these tricky issues.
Yeah, and I guess that speaks to that earlier conversation that we had with Calvin as well around creating a space for a dialogue on some of these issues, and because food is such an important sector for the Welsh economy as well, whether that's through agriculture or like food product processing as well. Okay, we're going to come on to a second question. Ian Cox says businesses typically focus on efficiency and decarbonisation because it saves money. What are the practical ways organisations can go further towards nature and climate positive outcomes that also deliver commercial value? Michelle, maybe you're, without wanting to force you to answer, I think this suits you.
Yeah, no, I hopefully I've shared a few examples. I hope we can be a role model for other businesses across Wales to look at practical approaches. For us, I think the focus on having a transition plan where we have published our ambitions from a decarbonisation perspective outlines where we're trying to focus, but also collaborate. And I think a lot of this is around collaboration. But practically, some of the examples I've given today. So actually, Barbara, hello, Size of Wales, also a partner with us alongside the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, alongside the National Trust, etc., etc. There's so many amazing partners doing fantastic things, not just across Wales, but across the globe. And what we've tried to do is promote imperfect environmentalism. So say, look, we're not going to be perfect. We haven't got data's constantly improving. Calvin mentioned data earlier and the importance of data, but we've just got to keep acting, piloting, trialing. So we're investing in lots of different innovative projects and looking for breakthrough moments when it comes to nature. As I say, beavers is one of my absolute favourites at the moment because it's really been brought to life, not for all of us, our colleagues, as well as future generations of children who go and watch that amazing, incredible film in local cinemas. So hopefully, in that, gives some practical examples where businesses can help, and it's a win-win for the business as well as creating sustainable growth for the future, which is ultimately where we need to be, because as I said previously, as one of the largest private sector employers in Wales, it's really important they're a sustainable business and continue to provide jobs and support to local communities.
There's a further question here, which I'm gonna float towards your direction, Shav. Do panelists think that our new PR voting system will produce a Senedd that will be more open to discussing some of these issues, complex, long-term challenges that require ultimately trade-offs and investment behind them? And I guess the thinking behind that question is potentially a Senedd that has more representation from lots of different parties. Does that facilitate a better space for us to have some of those conversations? Shav, if you don't want to answer it, that's fine.
I'm happy to answer it. Look, I've always been a supporter of PR. There's loads of arguments over whether or not this was the DeHaan system is the best PR system that we could have chosen, but we've got it now and we're kind of stuck with it potentially for a little bit. I'm someone who comes from a background where I believe in, people working in collaboration, in social partnership, figuring things out. Sometimes you've got to tough it out. You've got to have that disagreement in order to come out the other side. And I think that particularly when it comes to this subject matter, if we are going to survive and we are going to progress as Wales, we've got to get this right. And I'm hoping that the next Senedd is that we have enough progressives in place to be able to work together for the betterment of the people of Wales. And my biggest concern in all of this is that what I don't want to see is where we have just 4 years of just lots of arguments going on, not being able to make good decisions, and Wales gets left behind. Because those jobs and those investments that are currently potentially on the table will go elsewhere, and we will yet again lose out. And we'll keep having these types of conversations. And in the meantime, loads of people would have lost their jobs. People would have left Wales. We're already hearing about young people in particular who, are, looking elsewhere, are leaving and so forth as well. But also there's real opportunities for us here to grow, and sustain our public sector, but also to have real good, green energy, but also good jobs for the future as well. So I want us to fixate on that, and I hope that that's where we land.
Thank you for answering that, Shav. A good answer. Calvin, I want to come to you just for the final question. There's lots of questions in the Q&A, but also some comments about particular sectors that might be kind of growth sectors over the medium to long term, whether that's hemp or timber, for example, which Calvin, I'm sure you can speak to, but equally they're spoken to in your report as well. One point that someone makes is, how do panelists think circular economy and donor economic principles can be championed to gain traction and acceptance to the general public to drive change from the bottom up? What are your thoughts on that, Calvin, in regards to those kind of alternative economic models and their salience for driving change?
Right, the general public don't care about the economy unless it affects them, right? You got no chance talking to people who don't know economics in the street. I've tried. I wouldn't start there. I would argue that the people you need to talk to about donor economic circularity is the companies who are operating in Wales, who are, with a nod to the panelists, am I right? Am I right? Not headquartered in Wales and don't really care about Wales. So if you're Tesco's, why do you care what the Welsh Government thinks about donor economics or circular economies? If you're Airbus, do you really care about the Welsh Government talking to you about how you do recycling? You'll do your legislative duty. And so I think it's, in those cases, it's about identifying sectors, not least public sector and procurement, where you can genuinely enforce or coerce and then encourage, through supply chains, through regulation, companies to behave better and to drive proper effectiveness rather than just financial efficiency in their systems. And that would be enough for us to be getting on with. We haven't done very much on that. I mean, we just spent a lot of money with RAP, for example, doing some stuff around workplace recycling, which is obviously a good thing, but complicated and clunky. I think we need to choose our battles very well. We spent years, right, talking about Port Talbot and still are talking about Port Talbot in a situation where the Welsh Government had no influence over that, right? I know because I was involved in it in bits and pieces. Tart didn't care what the Welsh Government thought about the steelworks because the Welsh Government didn't have 500 million quid to give them. So we need to be much more careful and targeted in the audiences for some of these interesting, innovative approaches and a little less concentrated on what the media are talking about, I think.
Yeah, I think within that, that's why hopefully this conversation, but other conversations, certainly we've been trying to have on key policy issues you know, is because it's a devolved election, focusing on things that devolved government are actually capable of doing, and not being and being realistic about that, and about, unfortunately, because of the makeup of the devolution settlement, you can't do everything. Therefore, there's trade-offs in what you can do, which means, articulating what the green economy, for example, might look like is incredibly important, because it's that is a reflection of where you're allocating scarce resources when it comes to the economy in Wales, really. So it's kind of positive side of that is more agency over the amount of money that we do have. So hopefully we've managed to kind of touch around those issues today. Okay, I don't want to keep everyone for longer. I know that this really interesting discussion could have gone in all manner of different directions, but hopefully we've managed to give the panelists an opportunity to talk through their certain perspective. I've certainly found it fascinating. And as I said, can go in a million different directions, but has been really interesting. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the attendees. A recording of this webinar will be published later on, probably later on this week. So if you want to share that, then by all means, because, definitely keen to get to as wider audience as possible with this conversation. An hour feels so short when you have so much to discuss, but which isn't always the case. I go away from this conversation feeling quite hopeful, rather than feeling a bit more doom that I sometimes do when I come out of these conversations. So thank you all for your time. Diolch, everyone. And we hope you've enjoyed this webinar.